How much do students owe NSFAS?
So historical students owe us about 45 billion across about 845,000 students. I think the perception created in the media of this kind of chaotic fund, where everything is going wrong, is not correct. I think you can pick and choose and say, in a fund that has 900,000 students, you're bound to have day-to-day complaints. Today we produce 4 times the amount of Black African graduates than we did in 1994.
The sustainability of 300 a month.
The reality is that any adjustment you make is times 900,000 students. So it doesn't run into the hundreds of millions, it often runs into the billions.
Welcome back to Palatable Politics, where we make politics palatable. With me, your host, TJ Maslela. Welcome to the show. In today's session, we're going to be discussing higher education and the funding around it, in particular, NSFAS. And here to give us insight and coming back to Palatable Politics is the Acting CEO of NSFAS, Mr. Waseem. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me back.
So you left NYDA. Now you're here in a different capacity of NSFAS acting CEO. How's that challenge been coming into NSFAS?
Yeah, I think if you think about it, you've got to contextualize where NSFAS is at to appreciate the scale of it. It's obviously been in the media a lot, and the fund itself has been unstable for quite a considerable period of time. Just to give you a sense, it has had 3 boards now in the last 10 years. It's been in and out of administration twice. It's had 9 CEOs or acting CEOs in the last 9 years, So those numbers just give you a sense of the scale of instability within the fund. And obviously I came in at a time where, the second administration period was coming to an end and a new board had to be appointed. So, and I think probably the difference between NYDA and NSFAS is the scale of NSFAS. At any point in time, you have about 900,000 students which are dependent on the fund, and you can't stop. The fund's got to keep working, and appreciating the scale of that challenge, you really realize the priority it holds in the national interest, and how you can't afford for things to go wrong.
What has the cause of the instability been over the 9 years? Fine, I know it was before your time, but
yeah. So I think NSFAS has gone through a number of external and internal changes, and I'll reflect on some of them. Right. So of course, most of us know that the decision to introduce fee-free higher education has always been an aspirational view of the democratic government. But the manner in which it was done, of course, we had fees must fall and there was quite a great deal of pressure. And then we had the Hehe Commission report. And then, of course, we know how the announcement or the pronouncement of free education was done in South Africa. And I just want you to appreciate for a second here. So that announcement was made around about December 2017. Now, this is an entity which is primarily focused on loans. Its systems, its capacity is built on issuing loans. And late in December, when most people are, preparing for leave or whatever else, the decision comes. Just think about how much needs to change in the background from, an application cycle towards assessing beneficiaries, towards communicating with universities for that to happen. And that policy decision, NSFAS has never really, transitioned itself into fulfillment of that policy decision, or it's probably only reaching maturity in terms of that now. But then in addition to that, NSFAS also tends at times to inflict wounds on itself here. I'll give you an example, is to say the student accommodation function, which is primarily managed by institutions, right? And not always well managed here. Yeah? So you would find instances where, institutions would place students in accommodation that was not conducive to learning. And then instead of supporting institutions to fix the issues they're having with student accommodation, NSFAS decides, no, well, we're going to get more involved in the student accommodation sector, when your mandate has very little to do with property management, But again, you don't really seem to build the policies, the skills, the capacity to manage such a complex function. And if those two weren't enough, for the third time, the policy decision is let's introduce a missing middle loan fund. But again, NSFAS is not ready from a organization perspective. It hasn't built the systems, the processes to adequately administer that. And you get this history of an organization that seemingly doesn't build the requisite support to implement the policy decisions. And this is not happening at a small scale, it's happening at a large scale here. And I think that to a large extent has caused the levels of instability that we see in the fund today. Yeah.
So you're saying that the decision for free higher education was communicated and then discussed?
Was it really discussed? I'm not sure it was discussed. It was proclaimed and it was implemented. There'll be debates about whether education is truly free or not in South Africa. But there was a fundamental policy shift away from loans towards granting bursaries to students who come from poor and working class families. And let me say, undoubtedly, it's a very progressive decision and one that aims to fulfill, the vision of the Freedom Charter.
Okay, so before the decision and transition, it was purely loans. Whoever got funded via NSFAS, if they met the criteria, or as long as just a person wanted to study, NSFAS would grant them a loan.
Yeah. It was a student loan funding model. Yeah.
And then now, what is the financial model?
So the financial model today is that students who come from households who earn a collective income of less than 350,000, or students that come from households which are dependent on SASSA via the child support grant, qualify for financial aid from NSFAS. Of course, they must also meet the academic criteria to be admitted to university or to TVET college. And those two buckets together, meeting financial criteria and meeting academic criteria, mean they can become an NSFAS funded beneficiary.
And then the missing middle.
Yes. So then the missing middle is students who come from households above 350,000 but less than 600,000 qualify for financial assistance via low interest loans from NSFAS.
What's the interest rate?
So you get charged no interest for the period of your study, and only when you start working does the prime interest rate start to apply.
And then I guess anyone over 600. Okay,
they're expected to self-fund themselves. So you get different classes in society, and certain students are expected to self-fund themselves.
And then, there are many scenarios where a person would say that, their father might be earning more than that, might be a lawyer somewhere, but has absconded.
Yeah.
How do you guys deal with that?
So you do come across those kind of social ills at NSFAS. A person will say, well, I'm from a household. My mother's a single mother. My dad I've not seen for many years or generations, and I can't. Although my income says it's an unfortunate scenario, but the current policy, which assesses household income, says that student should be able to fund themselves, or be funded via their family. And unfortunately, it's something that needs to be dealt with from a social development perspective, in that fathers need to be held accountable for the maintenance in which they owe, which includes funding the education of their children here. It's not necessarily an NSFAS related issue in terms of what we are required to deal with here.
And then, if I'm not mistaken, the numbers was about 842,000 students that were owing NSFAS about 45 billion.
Yeah.
How did it get down? Well, I think about 113 owed in excess of 500,000.
Yeah.
So let's start with how a student gets to owe NSFAS 500,000.
Yeah. So of course, for a long period of time, 1991 when DEFSA was established right until 2017, NSFAS was in the business of granting loans, right? And there was different criteria associated with the loans. So in many cases, students who graduated on time, who did well academically, could have their loan converted into a bursary, right? So there was that. There was many students who were paying their loans. There used to be policy that once a student had graduated and once the Revenue Service had confirmed that they were employed, students could be automatically garnished to pay back. And NSFAS's collection rate was at a really good rate. The Constitutional Court ruled that was not legal, and that resulted in collections dropping quite fundamentally. But then again, we come back to the 2017 decision, and a lot of students were of the incorrect view that their loans had been forgiven. That was not part of the decision here. Students still have to pay, or the beneficiaries still have to pay those loans back. Again, NSFAS doesn't help itself. When it made that shift from loans to bursaries, it's almost like people forgot about the loans. The systems were not kept up, statements were not sent out to students, and what we see in research around repayments and loans is that keeping people informed, getting your statement on time, getting communication drives repayment rates. And that entire process collapsed in the background. And it's what we're trying to rebuild and encourage people to repay. And just to make a point is to say, we're not here to chase poor people. We know the economy is not in great shape. If people are unemployed or they're struggling, those are not the kind of people we're looking after. But there's a lot of medical doctors, chartered accountants, actuaries, engineers from the humanities who are graduating, who are doing well. Some of them own 2 homes and 2 cars. Those people must pay their loans here because we need that money back to fund new and upcoming beneficiaries.
At what point, how do you guys determine, okay, this person has gotten, whether it's a CN, they're doing articles and earning at 12,000 versus a doctor who, I don't know what they earn, but I know it's much higher rate. At which, how do you determine, okay, you start paying, you will give you a bit more time?
Yeah, I mean it's a case by case basis. It used to be 30,000 per month, I think, as the threshold at which you had to start repaying NSFAS. And of course, you deal with it on a case by case basis. I mean, it's the same with financial services institutions. If you fall behind on your house repayments or your car repayments, you can enter into an arrangement with the institution to say, I can only pay 50% or 60% here. And I think we're willing to do that on a case-by-case basis. I think you've got to, when you assess repayment, you've got to assess both income as well as assets and liabilities, and make a decision about how you'd like to collect on that loan.
And then the component of the bill, or what was it, bill that was issued by DTIC, that was taking the approach of being able to blacklist students who had not paid back their loans, which was subsequently withdrawn after, I think, about 20,000 comments in a week. Yeah. What was the intention there?
Yeah, so I can't speak for DTIC. I operate in a different department, right? So I mean, DTIC, as their name would suggest, looks at issues of trade, industry, competition, the economy per se, right? And I would assume that they were drafting those regulations to improve the ecosystem of credit in South Africa, around regulations and also consumer protection to some extent, right? We know there's reckless lenders, and it allows people to get into trouble. I think the challenge with student debt is it's such an emotive issue, right? Simply because a lot of students pursue higher education with the aspiration of being able to achieve social mobility, improve their lives, lift themselves out of poverty, support their families, and in that aspiration to acquire higher education qualifications, students do what it takes, including accumulating debt. Now, students already feel like they're carrying the world on their shoulders, like the deck is stacked against them, They come from intergenerational poverty. They make it through a difficult basic education system. They get admitted to university. They might trip up. They incur debt. Even when they incur debt, sometimes they can't get their graduation certificates. They struggle to. And I think that probably was the ignition of the fire that drove the 20,000 comments. And I do think we need to be very sensitive about how we deal with issues around students, around student debt, because I do think it's very aspirational in nature. Yeah.
So there's student A, Sembali, she has, you guys are funded, let's say in the middle, so it was a loan. She concludes, then she can come, once she gets a job, then she can come and engage on a payment plan. Okay, that's straightforward. What happens to a TJ that goes and doesn't finish studies, conclude his studies, or even takes longer than anticipated? How do you guys treat a TJ, and is he still liable even though he didn't necessarily finish?
So in the current model, once you're funded, you have to meet certain academic progression criteria. I mean, I'm sure you've probably heard about the N+1 rule. So N+1 says you have one additional year over and above what it takes to complete the qualification in minimum time. So 3-year qualification, an NSFAS student will have up to 4 years to complete their qualification. If you fall out in your second year or your third year, it's a bursary, so we don't want those funds back. What we're picking up more and more is that there are students who get close to finishing who don't meet the NSFAS academic progression criteria. So let's say I'm an 4-year mechanical engineering student. I'm on my 5th year, so I no longer qualify for NSFAS, or I've taken 5 years already, but I'm 4 modules away from completing. That's a difficult situation because the labor market, that's a person with 3 years of engineering, but the labor market says they're equivalent to a matriculate. And I think a lot of the research is telling us we may need to design a specific product to help students who are on the cusp of qualification, to help them get over the line, even if it be via a loan, because likelihood is they're going to become employed and be able to repay that quite quickly.
So that would be in the case of a grant. Now, in the case of a person that fell in the missing middle and everything was loaned.
They need to pay the loan back. There's no two ways around that one.
Okay. And then, so in the example you use now, that was the case of, I think you said an engineer, right?
Yeah.
There are, I'm not going to go about how I was privileged to find out, but there was a situation of students being funded for degrees, diplomas, etc., that don't necessarily give them the greatest prospect of gaining employment afterwards. How does NSFAS deal with that?
So let's take a step back from how NSFAS deals with that, right? I think you have somewhat of a societal issue in South Africa. I think the average young South African and the average South African family believes that the route to success is go to school, work hard, go to university, irrespective of the degree, get a job and live your life, which is somewhat correct. Graduates have the lowest form of unemployment. That is true. We know that. However, it is not the only pathway to economic success. And I think sometimes we force young people to university. We force them to degrees that are not aligned to their talents, their skills, their capacity as individuals. So in its current format, NSFAS funds everything. There's no provision or limit on the qualifications that we fund. We do find that there is an oversubscription on humanities as opposed to, for example, STEM and business or finance. We find that there's quite an oversubscription on universities compared to TVET colleges. And I think more and more as we think about the fund and the future of the fund, the fund has to be in the country's national interest. And we have to focus on funding critical skills that are important for the economy. Mainly because we're using state funding to be able to support that. It's a challenging conversation. I think you also pick up interesting dynamics. When I look through the list of qualifications that we fund, I picked up a 3-year diploma in photography. Now, if we send a student to study a 3-year diploma in photography at a university with tuition, allowances, accommodation, even if they graduate on time, we'll spend about 500,000 on that student. I'm pretty sure I could send that student to a short skills course, probably buy them a camera to start their own business, and we wouldn't spend more than 50 or 60,000. Yeah. And I think those are the kind of conversations. The way we think about young people's pathways through the economy, we have to have the societal shift away from university as the only pathway, because, like you say, one, degrees are becoming less and less relevant, but two is that the cost of university education is incredibly expensive. Yeah.
What's the difference between universities and TVET?
Yeah, so I mean, TVETs offer more in the relation of occupational trades. So you're looking at training boiler makers, plumbers, electricians. TVETs offer some level of engineering courses as well, but your typical artisans, craftsmen, tradesmen are trained at your TVET colleges. TVET colleges also offer, alternative degrees. They offer degrees in hospitality and a number of other things here. But what we find when we look at our applications, 95% of people want to go directly to university, and it's almost like TVET becomes the second choice. It's like, okay, I didn't get into university, so I'll take a TVET. And we have to change the mind shift around that, because I'm sure if you've ever got someone to come and fix your geyser, or someone to fix your plumbing, or someone to fix your garage door, those people are making good money here. Yeah. And we have to shift the mindset towards those are really good qualifications and they produce real skills that can be utilized in the market. Yeah.
Have you guys done a study to indicate how many payback? Yeah. So how many that would have gone the university route? What the return or payback percentages versus those that have gone the TVET route?
In terms of employment?
Yeah, but both employment to the extent to which they are able to pay back.
Yeah, I mean the payback is difficult to assess simply because NSFAS's loan systems collapsed. I think as we rebuild that, we'll probably get data that will support our view. But we're doing quite an interesting study with the South African Revenue Service and National Treasury now, where we're comparing all NSFAS beneficiaries since the start of the fund against South Africa's tax and employment data. And I think that will not only tell us how many of those beneficiaries are employed, but it'll also tell us what income level they earn at. So how gainfully they are employed in the South African economy. And I think I'm quite excited for the results coming out of that survey. I think also to add is that, just this week, the Council on Higher Education released a survey about how, for the first time, I think, in democracy, the number of Black African students has increased at universities. And that largely, as cited in the report, is as a result of NSFAS. Yeah. The argument I'll keep making is to say it doesn't benefit anybody for a student to start university and not finish. We have to move away from access towards throughput and graduation. And even beyond that, employment, because that's what really matters. And that's how you drive the sustainability of the fund,
Then the students that get defunded during, I assume one might be the education criteria in terms of that N+1. Is that the only situation in which a student would be defunded?
Yeah, so if you read the entirety of NSFAS's bursary guidelines, you'll not find the word defunding, It's become quite a colloquial term that students use. NSFAS can only deregister a student if they don't meet the academic progression criteria or if they misrepresented themselves in the original application. In our current bursary guidelines and policy, we're not allowed to defund students. And if there is instances, students should report that to us so we can do a proper investigation. But we, policy-wise and guideline-wise, we can't deregister a student if they meet the criteria to continue in the fund.
but you guys can reject applications, because I also assume resources aren't infinite. So if a million.
Well. So on the current policy, technically we can't, right? Because if you meet financial eligibility and you meet academic eligibility, the state in its current pronouncement has committed to funding those students. I'm pretty sure that if someone would challenge us in court or through another legal process, we would be found wanting. Yeah, right. The Constitution and the Bill of Rights say that everybody has access to basic education. And it says the state will endeavor through reasonable measures to provide access to higher education. So it's not that the state should fund everybody. Of course, we have the 350,000 eligibility criteria here. But you are quite correct to say it's not sustainable, simply because you have almost a perfect storm of more students qualifying for higher education through better basic education results. Every year, the number of bachelor passes increases. Two is that South Africans are being pushed into a cost of living crisis, which means more students qualify for NSFAS from a financial perspective. And of course, we know state resources are flatlining, in real terms here. So you do have a sustainability problem. If NSFAS were to reduce the intake of students, what I would say is that we have to look at how do we create alternative pathways through the economy for those students. Yeah, I don't think we should be leaving students behind. And I think, whenever we talk to the minister, it's about that NSFAS shouldn't be the only exit or transition point from basic education to higher education. We need to think about better coverage through the entirety of the post-school education and training system.
I assume example might be the example used with photography in terms of sometimes might be better to buy someone a camera. Now, still with the alignment component, there's a national skills development strategy or plan. That was for 2030, which basically tried to align skills from whether it's TVET school, TVET universities, to the job market. One, have I captured it correctly, or is there something you'd want to add there before you let us know how you guys are doing in comparison to that?
I think you have captured it correctly, right? I think any strategy is underpinned by the strength of your economy, right? And I think what we have to be acutely aware of is that the South African economy has not been growing fundamentally for now, 15 years or so. And unless you manage to grow the economy fundamentally, you're not going to create the number of jobs at scale. You can skill people as much as you want, right? But you have to have demand side opportunities for young people to be able to work. So a skill strategy also has to be underpinned by an economic growth strategy, right? With that being said, you do find that graduates have the lowest form of unemployment. So it does pay for us to skill our young people through university, through colleges, because it does mean that they're more likely to be employed by their counterparts who have only a matric or less than a matric. I think another question we need to answer is that why is it for all the investment we make, only 1 in 2 NSFAS beneficiaries will eventually end up graduating? And what is the loss of investment to the state of young people who start but don't finish?
So I'm asking you that question.
So to me, it's massive. I don't think you can ever achieve a scenario where everybody graduates. The reality of any society is that not everybody who starts will finish. But I think the 50% is too low of a benchmark. We have to get that figure up for the system to be. You see, we sometimes get trapped in this conversation of loans versus bursaries, and it was a wrong decision to get to bursaries. I don't necessarily agree with that, simply because the system can be self-sustaining in nature. If you relentlessly focus on throughput and graduation, when students graduate, they enter the economy, they become employed, they pay taxes, those taxes regurgitate back into the economy. You create a self-sustaining system. But if you don't have that relentless focus on getting young people to finish, and it comes again to the decision about who to admit into university and creating the right pathways for young people. If you can get that model correct, I think you'll create a system that is much more self-sustainable in nature.
Moving away from the aspect of just education in itself and the things around it, particularly the accommodation.
Yeah.
What's the state of student accommodation in the country?
Yeah, so I think you get different levels of student accommodation, right? So at one level you have, university or campus accommodation. That's, if you ever went to campus, you'll know you get residences, and each res has its own, myths and initiation processes and all of those kind of things there, right? And there you stay on campus, campus is just a walking distance away and things like that. And that's owned and it's managed by a university or campus. You have had this proliferation of private student accommodation in the last decade or so. So if you drive in Hatfield, for example, next to the university, you'll see, high rises that advertise student accommodation there. So you have private student accommodation. And then you get areas where there's just no student accommodation. NSFAS just gives those students an allowance and says, go and find your own way. If you go to Alice, Fort Hare campus, 4,000 students don't have beds. So we just pay them an allowance and we say, figure it out, So there's a backlog of what we estimate to be about 200,000 shortage of student accommodation. And I don't necessarily see that as a problem. I see it as an opportunity, particularly in rural areas, for us to really drive local economic development through infrastructure development, of which student accommodation can be one pillar. Yeah.
So let's say one of the universities that has a lack of accommodation, if I've got a house near there or I've identified a property there, a piece of land, how do I go about doing business with NSFAS to ensure that students have accommodation there?
Yeah, I mean, all you need to do is put in an application. The details will be available on our website, and we'd send somebody out to come and do an accreditation and tell you if your household or building was fit to house students. If it does meet that criteria, you'd get listed on a portal. And should students become available and students would be comfortable living in that space, we would link the student with you and would manage the payment process associated with that accommodation. Yeah.
And the rates, are they pre-prescribed or?
Yeah. So NSFAS introduced the student accommodation cap, and there's different levels. So you get grade A to E. You get rates in metropolitan areas, non-metropolitan areas, and again, those are published on our website. Yeah.
I'd assume that rates in, whether it's your Brum, Hatfield, some of those rates can be high.
Yeah.
But do they fall within the rates that you guys have set out, or is there something that happens if they above that, or
so
for themselves?
Again, let's take a bit of a step back. So there was no regulation around student accommodation, right?
Okay.
And what you found that in some areas, people were charging up to 8,000, 9,000. Now, obviously, NSFAS has a budget to manage, and it couldn't manage to pay those rates. And the minister at the time would have introduced the student accommodation caps. So you're very correct in saying that in Gauteng and probably the Western Cape, landlords are not too happy with that cap here, and they say, it needs to be higher, or students should be allowed to pay top-ups, they should be allowed to charge top-ups. NSFAS has put a prohibition on charging top-ups. So that will continue to be regulated. If people want to do business with the state, they also have to do it on the state's terms and conditions. There is a fear, though, that NSFAS has also caused a little bit of issues in the market, and something the Competition Commission is looking at, because the scenario you have is that possibly in a less urban area, you had a landlord who was charging maybe 3,000 Rand a bed and And then saw the NSFAS accommodation cap and said, hey, well, actually, I can charge 4,000, And we may have artificially driven up prices in other areas of the country while seeking to regulate in some areas. So those are the kind of issues you have, when you're a price setter. I think you do cause those kind of issues. I think student accommodation in its entirety needs a bit of an overhaul. We've started that process. So we've introduced a student accommodation protocol for next year that is aimed to bring some guidance, some regulation, some framework to student accommodation, because the situation we inherited was pretty messy. Yeah.
And then students that automatically, I assume if they qualify for the education component, they automatically qualify for the accommodation.
So there's two types. So if you live within a distance of 10 kilometers of campus, we give you a transport allowance. And if you live more than 10 kilometers, you qualify for an accommodation. Yeah.
But that must be applied for separately.
So generally, when a student applies for NSFAS, they'd indicate if they need transport or they need accommodation, one of the two, and then that needs to be confirmed by the institution upon registration.
Now, what happens? Because I do know of someone who has student accommodation, and they've said some of the challenges they've experienced would be on day of registration or first day of school, whatever it is. Students rock up, they didn't know that they don't have accommodation or that they had to.
Yeah.
How do you guys deal with that?
So I can't speak to what's happened in the past, but it's a pretty chaotic situation. Every year we're flooded with images of students sleeping in libraries, who don't have accommodation. And one of the things I've said to the team at NSFAS is, why does it have to be so chaotic, right? It's like, we kind of know at an estimated amount how many students we're expecting. We know how much accommodation we have available. Can we not run a very thorough process of matching? So for example, if I know I'm going to have in the region of 5,000 returning students at WITS in 2000, I want to know from WITS before I break in December about where my 7,000 students are going to be housed, right? And then I want a team at WITS who in the first week of registration is going to be there to support those students and placing them in their accommodation. So I think a lot of these things, we allow them to become crises by not planning properly. It's not rocket science exactly what we're doing here. So what we're really focused on is how do we plan for much smoother registration cycle next year. Yeah. You also have an instance of landlords taking students, placing them in accommodation, not confirming that they're NSFAS funded, and then sending NSFAS an invoice, and we're not going to pay those. And then when you don't get paid, you run to the media. And we're not going to find any sympathy from us if you do things like that. Yeah.
And then with regards to, so you've partially answered the one part that NSFAS doesn't pay student accommodation on time, etc.
Yeah.
Are you saying everyone else that's followed the process, they do get paid on time, or are there also issues?
Yeah, there? I mean, of course, it was chaotic when I arrived there.
So how long have you been there?
This is my 8th month now. Yeah, it was chaotic, and you get different types of landlords. You get landlords who own thousands of beds. You get landlords who, as a small Inyana conversion, who own 10 beds. And one of the things the team proposed is that they go and hold sessions in each of the provinces, and they sit down with the landlords, because I was not necessarily responsible for the onboarding process, right? And what I've just described is, if you have a good onboarding process, downstream everything tends to work. But I said, let's try and fix what would have happened. And we had one-on-one sessions. We sat with every landlord. We said, these are the students that are confirmed. This is the payments. This is, another issue we have is that students are marked as transport, but they're staying in accommodation. Now, you will know we get audited. If an auditor comes and asks, well, why are you paying accommodation for a transport student? You're going to have to answer that question. So those are the issues we sat with landlords one-on-one. And I really think we've stabilized. I mean, I haven't seen anything in the last few months that suggests, there's mass evictions or payments. We do owe some money for 2024, which we intend to honor before the end of this year. But I think largely we've stabilized the student accommodation space. We've got the majority of payments up to date. And now it's about a very clear guideline and onboarding process for 2026. So we don't see a repeat. And of course, infrastructure development. So we start to clear the backlog on beds as well.
When you say there are some people you haven't paid from the previous financial year, is that a 10 billion deficit?
No.
Where does that 10 billion deficit come from?
So the deficit came from the fact around, again, this idea that, it's like we don't plan. We know how many students we're expecting. So basically on the current policy, NSFAS accepted way more students than what its budget would allow it to, and that's because more students qualified, they were accepted at universities. And I took the decision to say I can't keep registering beyond my budget because I'm also committing financial misconduct in terms of the PFMA, and we kind of had to get to that inflection point. And of course, we reprioritized funds, and all those students have been registered, and we found the money for this year. But one of the things is we've said is it can't carry on like this into the future. We have to come up with what is a sustainable funding framework, and that looks at many things. It looks at, one, like you said, the type of skills that we fund. What is the kind of benefits that we offer? What's the academic criteria that you meet? So I've said the N+1 rule. That's the only thing. If you are an NSFAS student at the moment, you can fail your entire first year, and we're obligated to fund you for the next year. And I don't think that's correct. NSFAS students should be the best students. You should have progression criteria. You should have minimum criteria that you need to meet to be funded for the next year. And I think those become the important kind of reforms that we need to implement in the fund to get it back on a sustainable path. Yeah.
So on that now, just thinking of a case like mine, that I started on the finance route. Somewhere along the way I said, nah, this is not for me.
Yeah.
I want to do politics, economics, all those things.
Yeah.
What happens with the NSFAS student in that case?
So we will assist you, one, on the basis that the university approves the change, but two, you stay within the guidelines around the N+1 rule. Yeah. So you have to still finish within the minimum time here. Yeah. That becomes the guideline that we apply to students who want to make changes, or also who want to switch between institutions.
Yeah. And then the allowances component. I assume that's the last, or is there more?
In terms of benefits,
Students, beneficiaries.
Yeah.
The allowance, what happens there? Is that straightforward that everyone that gets accepted automatically gets an allowance?
Yeah. So you get a number of allowances. So you get the book and material allowance, which is or book and learning material allowance, which is meant to cover, as the name would suggest, either a device or books if you want them in hard copy. You get the living allowance, which is paid monthly for each of the 10 months. And then is
that a standard?
That's about 16,000 a year, about 1,600 a month for 10 months. And then you get the personal care allowance. So the living allowance more to cover meals, and then the personal care allowance cover living necessities, which is the personal care allowance is about 3,000 a year, so about 300 Rand a month. And then distance students, so
300 a month for personal care.
Yeah. So combination of your allowances take you to about 1,900 a month. That's outside of your accommodation and book allowance. Yeah.
The sustainability of 300 a month.
Are you saying the sustainability, is it too low or too high?
Yes, as a individual, as a student.
Yeah. I mean, I think we understand that. I think it's looking at South Africa's economic factors. We can point to many instances. How does a public EPWP worker survive on 2,400 a month? How does someone on the SRT grant survive on 350 a month? These are nuances that we need to answer. The reality is that any adjustment you make, and this year we made fundamental adjustments. We adjusted the allowances by 4%. We brought parity between TVET and university allowances. Generally, TVET students used to get lower. This is the first year that they were equalized in nature. The reality is that any adjustment you make is times 900,000 students. So it doesn't run into the hundreds of millions. It often runs into the billions.
And 100 rand seems small, but
it seems small. It's similarly on the SRT grant. I mean, the 350 has only been increased once to 370. And until we get the economy growing and moving and state resources increasing, it is going to be difficult. I guess where we are, we're also concerned about certain things like alcohol and substance abuse among students. We're concerned about increase in online gambling among students. And we do think there's more needs for financial guidance, mentorship for students, because you're giving kids as young as 15 cash-based allowances. It does propose a risk to the organization and also to the wider economy.
So as young as 15?
Yeah, remember, to go to a TVET college, you can exit grade 9 and go to a TVET college. So TVET colleges accept from the age of 15.
Okay, so you guys, as soon as a person completes, is it NQF 3 or 4? Okay, doesn't matter. Grade 9.
I think so. Yeah.
From grade 9, then they can go. Okay.
Yeah. So it's for students who are not coping academically. Remember, at one point we had a conversation about a grade 9 exit certificate. So students do have that pathway into TVET.
Yeah. And then still back to the allowance component. One would, obviously, I don't know the challenge of being a woman, but for women or girls, however you want to categorize, should they not be an additional, whether it's an amount or care package? Because I assume women go through woman things.
Yeah.
Is there something to help with things like that, especially when there are delays? Because I know there also are sometimes delays in payment.
Yeah. I mean, we haven't experienced delay for a considerable period of time now. I mean, throughout 2025, we had one payment that was 12 hours late due to a system glitch. But other than that, all our payments this year have been on time, I guess, the question about adjustment of allowances for certain categories is always a difficult one to answer. I'll give you an example. Medical students are I don't want to say on my case, but medical students have made a case to say they do 12 months. They don't do 10 months at university. They deserve allowances for 12 months, Changing it for medical students has an impact, because I can tell you it's not only medical students who are affected by that. It does come down to budgetary decisions that we need to make. And I guess it's a choice. And again, people in the Western Cape are very angry. They say we're underpaying for accommodation. You've got to, at the end of the day, it's a choice between the number of students that you want to fund and the value of the benefits that you're offering. UNISA students are very upset with me because they get 300 Rand a month because they're distant students, so they don't get the living allowance. And one of the things I keep saying is that think about the bigger objective here is that, one of the comments that was made is that, UNISA students get less than the people who get 370 Rand a month. And I said, but the people stuck on 370 are likely to stay on there for a long period of time because they are almost permanently unemployed or they have a lack of access to opportunities. You won't be stuck on 300 Rand a month because if you qualify and you graduate, you're likely to become employed and earn far higher than that. And I think, we all have our stories of struggling on campus and surviving on noodles at the end of the month. Of course, we have to have a balanced conversation about the value of benefits and how we support students in their academic journey.
You mentioned the element of gambling and alcohol. I know alcohol.
Yeah. I also know alcohol.
What's the challenge and how do you guys address it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are issues. So I think, NSFAS has tried many things in the past. It's tried a voucher system. We know they tried the direct payment system with a card-based system. I mean, students will argue that they fought this kind of progressive struggle to get it to cash-based allowances and get it to a point where they manage their own funds and they're in charge of their own lives and things like that. I hear that. I also remember I was a student and I was chaotic. You don't necessarily know responsibility at that age in your life. Yeah, and I think, NSFAS is not at the point now. We've got to do some other stabilization work, but I think we have to answer the question about what is likely to lead to the best elements of success amongst our students. And is cash-based allowances the right way to go about it? I'm not expressing a policy position. I'm willing to listen to both sides of the argument. But I do think we have a responsibility in how we disperse funds to also take ownership on how those funds are utilized and that they are being utilized for the right purposes to pursue academic success. Yeah.
And so I've covered all the bases, right?
Yeah.
Now, moving to 2026, what's the process like to ensure that the challenges that were experienced before your time, fair disclaimer, are not experienced again?
So I think the one is students must apply. Applications close on the 15th of November. We're not going to reopen applications. So students must apply. That's the first thing. 2, we want to communicate our funding decisions very early so that students are aware of what their financial status is and they have sufficient time to appeal. 3, we're working very closely with institutions as to how we consolidate the period of registration so that students know when they are eligible for registration and that they are able to know where they must travel to or what they need to do to be able to confirm their registration. 4 is communicating effectively, both with institutions as well as with learners, for them to know what their status is, where they need to travel to, what the process for registration is. 5 is to have sufficient capacity at institutions to make sure that students have the requisite support in going to the right accommodation, being placed, understanding what their financial status is, understanding. And if you get that period right, if you get the registration period right, everything else from there follows on quite effectively. Yeah.
And do you have a timelines for, okay, fine, application is 15 November, which won't be extended. Guys, you've heard, apply and subscribe also. Then by when would they expect feedback?
So first-time students can all expect to receive feedback on their funding status by the 15th of December.
Okay.
And then if they're unhappy with the outcome, they have a period of 30 days to apply. And then, of course, each institution has their own registration guidelines and whatnot. But we're very much trying to consolidate that process into that 2-week period, end of January, early February, so that we give clear timeframes on what needs to transpire.
And I assume the application decisions would also be tentative pending the outcomes of the matric results.
Yes. That's a big one. Right? Because and the NSFAS waits on academic eligibility from the institution. So, but that remains a decision between the institution and the student. Yeah.
In closing, there's a friend, colleague, who's a doctor. I think he's still a doctor now, UJ. And he did a study around students' funding and the cost of everything around it. And it was found that the biggest cost, they fought the fight of free education or low interest for those in the missing middle. But the cost of everything around universities now makes it unaffordable because everything in the precinct will now have student prices, which one would assume would be cheaper, but in some cases apparently it's more.
Okay.
Is there something to deal with that to make the lived experience of students more affordable? Or is that above your guys?
Yeah, so I've not seen the research. I've given the example of how I think accommodation prices might have gone up economics is an interesting subject, I think supply-demand issues, of course, these institutions, and take in mind that NSFAS disperses allowances in the region of 2 billion rand a month, across 76 institutions. Take into account that many students who are self-funded have spending power, supply demand drives economics. I think where we are, we're quite interested in what our mass buying power gives us. When I was a student discounts were a big thing, on meals, on clothing, on essential. You had to go there. Yeah, on all of those things there. And I think NSFAS needs to think about how our spending power gives us the ability to probably control market economics a little bit better and get the best value for our students. And I think that is an interesting opportunity. I'd have to go and research a little bit more about whether our allowances may have artificially also driven up prices. Yeah.
How much do students owe NSFAS?
So historical students owe us about 45 billion across about 845,000 students, former students.
How much of that do you guys expect to collect?
So our current collections are about 100 million a year, about 25 million a quarter. And I think it's just important to express, particularly where a student has benefited from the state and they've gone on to become employed and be a success and, own a house and send their kids to private school. You have an obligation to repay those funds so that other up-and-coming students can benefit from it. I think it's a critically important point to make. Yes, you may feel aggrieved that it was a loan, but it's what you signed up for here. And you owe that debt not only to yourself, but to society as well.
In closing, really, for the last
time.
In
conclusion,
what are some of the myths or anything you'd like to clarify around NSFAS?
Yeah, I mean, I think being inside the fund, right? I think the perception created in the media of this kind of chaotic fund, where everything is going wrong is not correct. I think you can pick and choose and say, in a fund that has 900,000 students, you're bound to have day-to-day complaints. But every month, there's an entire massive ecosystem that gets funded through NSFAS, right? And complaints exist. I'm not saying we're operationally perfect, but certainly the perception that's there is not necessarily true. I think the accommodation crisis and the possible evictions also is often overstated in nature. And I think we must be very careful of an agenda that seeks to dispel some of the gains of our democracy. NSFAS being one of them. Today we produce 4 times the amount of Black African graduates than we did in 1994. Those graduates are professionals, they are entrepreneurs, and many of them have been funded by NSFAS. 60% of government DGs, DDGs, and chief directors were funded by NSFAS. In addition to broad-based Black economic empowerment, employment equity, which I get a sense is being positioned in a very negative sense. These have been transformational policies for many young Black South Africans. We must seek to protect that in the work we do here.
Thank you. Thanks again for making time and coming again. Guys, please don't forget to like, subscribe, share, comment. Are you an NSFAS student? Have you benefit? Do you owe NSFAS? Are you going to pay? What's your plan?
You must pay.
Fine, you heard it. You must pay. But in the meantime, subscribe, like, share. Palatable Politics.